Is the God of the Bible a gambler? And if so, does he have a problem? Well, if he were real, he is and he does. Now, one quick objection might be, well, if he has perfect foreknowledge, he can't be a gambler because he's going to know the outcome of every scenario. And if you want to go with that, that's fine. That produces way more problems than I'm even going to produce in this video. Look at the biblical examples, many of times which don't show this God, by the way, to have omniscience, as he is constantly, at least in the Old Testament, surprised, regretful, and angered all of a sudden. But regardless, the thing that got me thinking about this were my own children. They're getting to the age where there are necessary risks that they need to take for their own autonomy and growth. As a parent, it's important to figure out where to draw those lines. Now, I don't have perfect foreknowledge, but there are some things that I can assume with certainty. Let me give you a quick example and we'll dive into all of the biblical examples. If we lived next to an interstate and the ball rolled out into the street, it would simply be a never. You cannot get the ball, it's gone. I don't know for a fact that they're going to get hit, but the level of risk is so high that it is simply not worth it. Now, if we lived on a really quiet cul-de-sac where there was hardly ever any traffic, and I taught them very carefully to look left and then right, double check, and then go and get your ball, that to me would be an appropriate amount of risk. So when I compare my own parenting, which is flawed, I'm not a perfect parent, to the perfect God of the Bible, who is supposed to be the example of the good father, I see so many problems, to the degree of which I have to say, this God is simply willing to gamble with his creation, his children's well-being, their lives, and worse, their souls. And so that's what I want to cover with you today. And we're going to go through a ton of these gambles. And by the way, we're going to start out with some obvious ones. Please stick with me to the end of this video. I don't usually ask for that, but I know that I'm going to cover so much here that I think is so fundamentally important in understanding why this God simply doesn't work. And also right now, I'll just ask, go ahead and subscribe, like, share, comment, do all the things on this particular video. But let's dive in. We're going to try to go in chronological order, biblically speaking, best that we can. So pre-flood, I've got about 6 or 7 here. First is the imperfect creation gamble. Maybe the biggest gamble of all. God didn't have to. In fact, if you believe his word, his original plan was perfection. But yet here we are in a world with disease, with flaws, with terrors. You can see this video if you'd like to get more into depth with all of that, but the gamble here is that his creation would still find him to be a perfect creator despite his very flawed creation. That's a pretty big risk, and for many of us, it has been a huge swing and a miss. We could look at the free will experiment. Again, people often just put God in a box. Well, he had to give us free will because he didn't want robots. Well, heaven already messes that idea up, but let's not forget, this is an all-powerful God. He can do whatever he wants, and he chose to create a system with free will. This is truly probably the biggest bet that God is going to place, risking that his children will have the option to choose sin and death and hell, supposedly. And kind of in between these first two bets is the Eden setup. This is going to be bet number 3 for us, where God places a literal test for the first 2 beings that he creates. Everything is perfect. That's how God supposedly wants it, and he's going to give them the opportunity to fail. But he didn't just allow this one test to exist. He stacked the odds by allowing whatever the serpent is supposed to be, something there to further the temptation, the ease of access to this tree, the labeling of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Is knowledge so wrong? Even the fact that he didn't give them the knowledge of good and evil before, thus eliminating their actual awareness of what was at stake. There's 1,000 other ways that God could have tested his creation without creating the fall of man. It's so obviously just a mythological story, but if you're going to take it as literal truth and its implications for today, that we are still broken creatures in need of a savior, you first have to answer for why would this God risk so much? Keep in mind, there's been about 117 billion Homo sapiens that have existed. If we believe that each of them are imbued with the soul, and each of them was born with this sinful nature, damning them to hell from birth, unless they properly somehow find and do and believe just the right thing, then that first bet with the tree in the Garden of Eden becomes the most disgusting gamble of all time. And if you're a young earth creationist, that's still 15 billion people, and the vast majority that will be burning in hell. So we're taking a lot of time on these first three, and we're probably at 4 because I think allowing the serpent adds kind of a fourth gamble there. The fifth one is what all of this leads to, which is the problem of evil. God allows a world of evil and suffering to exist and still hopes that people can find their way to believing that he is a good God, which is necessary for people to worship him and follow him and put trust in him. Many people, myself included, are more than willing to accept that there could be a God out there. And many people, like myself, immediately remove this God from the possibility of that because he is either not the good God he says he is, thus refuting his claims in the Bible and making himself falsifiable, or he's straight up evil and not worthy of my worship, or not trustworthy of my devotion. So now we've covered the problem of original sin, free will, and the problem of suffering, all bets that have not gone well for God and make no sense for a good father. But what's his next string of bets? Maybe he moves on to a different table game, and this one is going to be the flood wager. Things got away from him. He regretted the creation that he made, even though it was made exactly how he intended it to be, with his perfect foreknowledge, if we're going to again attribute these things to God. That's problematic in and of itself, but the bet is that the world would be better, that humanity 2.0 would somehow get it right. And he lost that bet immediately, in the sense that Noah sinned almost as soon as you could sin, as well as his sons. And from there, it simply did not get any better. So all that genocide, all that murder, all that suffering, all those animals, all those babies, all those women, all those people who were collectively not horrible and evil, paid an awfully hefty price for God's 2.0 gamble that failed as absolutely soon as it could. This moves us straight into our next gamble, which is the Tower of Babel risk. God, who claims himself to be not the author of confusion, purposely confuses people, creating new languages and scattering them around the earth. And what is the bet here? The bet is that these people will still be able to find him, even though he's not going to appear to most of the places on earth for a very, very long time, if at all, and that he's only going to give his holy scriptures in 3 of the many thousands of languages, relying on humans to be able to translate them and spread them around this large globe. Keep in mind, he didn't provide for anything that would be necessary to overcome these odds. We didn't get the printing press for millennia, nor did we cross the oceans. There was simply no hope for the vast majority of all people who have ever lived because of this decision, this bet from God. I hope that you're seeing failure after failure after failure. And the best thing you can do, especially if you're a parent, is just compare yourself. Really, compare yourself with God. I don't care how bad of a parent you think you are. I can almost guarantee you are miles above this God. If you had just 2 children and they were going to be 100% dependent off of you for their survival and their eternal fate, would you raise them each with their own language so that they could not communicate or work together? And then would you provide them the instructions for how to live life and find you in a different language than those 2 with simply no way to access it? Because that's what God did for billions of people on this planet. So again, try to put yourself in these situations and see if you would ever do anything that resembles any of these gambles at all. Here's an interesting one I almost didn't include because of the obvious objection, but the Abraham-Isaac bet. God risking that Abraham would kill his own son if allowed to go so far, or worse, what if Abraham wasn't willing? God would have to break this covenant. It would completely erase all of the plans this God supposedly has. And if you have a little objection going off in your head, you're 100% right. And I want to take a second to explain this. The only way that this actually works is for God to both know that Abraham would make the right choice, which is being willing to murder your own child, again, good father material, and that God would be able to stop him in time. Only under those 2 conditions do we literally get everything else that we have in the Bible and in history, supposedly. And that requires God to be doing 2 things: to be knowing everything that will happen and to be willing to interfere. So again, if you don't like my earlier gambles about the problem of suffering or free will, that's fine. But then you have to admit that people don't really have free will because God is only putting people in situations where he knows the outcome and he is interfering physically in the world to create those outcomes. This is a lose-lose for apologetics. Here's a big one. What about the Sodom and Gomorrah gamble? God allows Abraham to negotiate with him, literally gambling with the lives of the people based off Abraham's ability to wear God down. And ultimately, this failed anyways because God still destroys the cities. But somewhere in there is a scenario for that bet where some people are saved, but others aren't. Or where potentially, if Abraham had been able to negotiate himself all the way down to just Lot to spare the cities, God wouldn't have destroyed anyone at all. While we're on the same story, we could talk about the gamble of Lot's wife. What could possibly be the point here? And I actually do understand from kind of a meta-truth, moral teaching standpoint, you could pull something out of this. But again, one must believe that this is literal, that these were actual people. Because Lot's wife is dead, because she loses the gamble, by the way, he's then in a position where his daughters rape him. But that's 100% required to get us to Jesus, by the way, from a genealogy standpoint. So this can't just be some meta-truth about turning fully from destruction and not looking back or whatever you want to try to extrapolate from this. And by the way, I'm willing to be wrong on that. If someone can show me something different, I will correct myself. But my understanding is that Lot's eldest daughter with Lot has a son named Moab, the ancestor of the Moabites, where we get Ruth. And Ruth and Boaz are the great-grandparents of King David, and we know through King David we get the lineage of Jesus. So if I'm understanding everything correctly, Jesus is 100% a descendant from this ancestral rape. Again, bringing forth the literal nature of these stories instead of some metaphorical moral truth. But let's keep going. You know what else is a gamble? Having favorites. If I choose between my two children to bless one and curse the other, love one and hate the other, provide for one but not the other, I risk, especially with the one I'm hating, them not loving me back, them not following me. I'm also risking their children and future generations saying, hey, what's up with that? This can't be a good father, a good grandfather. And yet time after time with these early patriarch families, we see exactly just that from God. Whether it's Cain and Abel, in this case we have God favoring Abel's offering over Cain's, which leads, by the way, to our first murder. We have Isaac favored over Ishmael, which the implications of that deserve their own video. It's multifaceted, but that's definitely a major contention for the differences and the infighting between Islam and Judaism, or now Christianity. Also, Jacob and Esau. God favored Jacob over Esau even before they were born. God set up Esau and his descendants, Edom, the Edomites, to be enemies, essentially, forever, and Joseph and his brothers. Again, all of those deserve a lot more time and attention than we're going to be able to give them here, but you can see the gamble of playing favorites does not pay off. Unless, and by the way, this is maybe one thing that is worth pointing out, unless God isn't a good father, unless his goal isn't to have everyone saved, unless he doesn't care about all the collateral damage along the way. And this is really the two camps that one has to fall into. You either actually believe what God and Jesus say about themselves. Both of them in different parts of the Bible say they desire that none should be lost. Well, then all these gambles so far directly fly in the face of that. Or you're forced through the actions of God that actually happened despite his words to say, oh, he's not a good father. He doesn't care to save everyone. He doesn't love everyone. He's sovereign. His will be done despite any of us lowly creatures. Take your pick. They're both horrific outcomes. So that was just Genesis. And I wanted to go hard in Genesis because it's where we get the setup for so much. But I also want to point out we could go harder and we could go that hard for all the books of the Bible. This God is downright playing with his creation, like a sadistic kid with an anthill. And there's truly too many examples. So we're going to start speeding up and we're going to start doing less examples from each book. But just know how many of these issues there truly are. The gamble of wanting to show off his power via the plagues, via hardening Pharaoh's heart, was a big one. How many Israelites suffered every time Pharaoh's heart was hardened by God? And if you need more on that, instead of all the apologetics you've heard, check out this video here. But again, how many Israelites suffered and how many innocent Egyptians suffered and died, just so God could play this tug of war game. And he says as much. He tells Moses ahead of time the plan, and he is not going to let Pharaoh let the people go so that he can do these wonderful things. He also says in there somewhere that the goal of it is so that eventually Egypt will know that he is God. That doesn't happen either. Gamble lost. This next one's not my strongest one, but I do think it's interesting to think about these implications. God just takes these people out of slavery. For supposed centuries, they have been at the whim of someone else. They have had leadership in their life. They have had a commander. They have had someone telling them what to do. He takes them out into the wilderness and immediately robs them of their leader. He takes Moses up to Mount Sinai and leaves them at their own, without yet providing for them all the necessary instruction. And sure enough, they fail this test. They make a golden calf, turning to idolatry and getting severe punishment for it. But a caring parent can still give free will and help. Again, considering the condition of these people that had been in slavery and now are scared and taken out on their own and now without leadership, maybe God could have provided something better. Again, going back to my own children, I can deprive them of sleep and feed them nothing but sugar. And yes, they still have the free will to be obedient or not, but I've created conditions that make it much more possible and probable that they won't. And when you have something that is lesser or smaller or more dependent, you do have a responsibility, right? If my kid goes into kindergarten and they are a terror, they're falling asleep at their desk, they're disruptive, they're angry, they get in a fight with another kid, they talk back to the teacher. Yeah, some of that's on them, but I would argue most of it is on me. And so what I'm not arguing here for is to take away the responsibility from any of these individuals. No, I'm saying let's also, though, give God the responsibility he deserves. If I would be somewhat responsible for my kindergartner and their behavior in class, with this very small delta compared to the delta between God and us lowly creatures of the dirt, then how much more responsible would God need to be in these situations? And yet, he is less. We continue to make excuses about how it's them, it's their problem, never God's. And I just think that's unacceptable and completely inexcusable and downright dumb. Can we stop making excuses for God that we wouldn't even make for man, right? Like that should be the simplest thing in the world. And as we're moving quickly through the Old Testament, you know what I always think about, and I have talked about it before, is the gamble of putting Saul in leadership over Israel. Again, this seems to catch God off guard when Saul doesn't turn out just the way he wants. And by the way, what's the big tipping point where God realizes Saul's not his guy and he better start anointing David? When Saul doesn't commit genocide fully because he leaves some animals and the king alive. With good intentions, by the way. Nope. God needs someone that will literally kill every man, woman, child, and animal. Not someone who thinks for themselves so they can offer a sacrifice with those goats later. Thus, David, a man after God's own heart. A man willing to do whatever God wills. Yikes. Moving into the Judges, God decides to give Samson this incredible power, and it is used to protect Israel. But it has a condition, his hair, and he's betting that Samson won't screw this up, that he won't tell the secret of his strength. Which he does pretty quickly and easily, by the way, risking all of Israel. Which is it? Are humans so sinful by nature and dumb and lowly that they cannot be trusted at all, with hearts that are nothing but deceitful above all else? Or are we God's one and only way of getting anything done in this world? And this is going to be a major point towards the end, so stick with me. I'm using this as a small example. We'll get back to it. Speaking of God allowing bad bets with Judges, what about Jephthah? God accepts the bet that Jephthah actually places. He makes a vow to kill the first thing that comes out of his house when he comes home if God grants him military victory. God says, yeah, sure, that sounds exciting. Let's place that bet. Oh no, it was the daughter. Sorry, now you have to commit child human sacrifice. Whoops, maybe it's time to move to a different table. Like, it's so stupid. And worse, if there is any truth to this at all, which thankfully there is not, what a horrendous God. What an inept and evil being this would really be. Again, God's hands are not tied. He can say, whoa, that's crazy. I want a military victory too. I'll just give it to you. Or he could say, whoa, no way. I don't do anything that could ever potentially lead to human sacrifice. At least not for a few more centuries. Then I'm going to do it to my own son. But he doesn't. He says, yeah, bet's on. That's your God. He's a gambler with a problem. Here's a crazy gamble. Going back to David, David messes up. He takes a census. Oh no, that he's not supposed to take, after being incited to do it by either God or Satan, or God using Satan, or just God being the Satan, the accuser, the adversary. Whatever your apologetic is there, it's still awful. And now God has to punish David. But you know what would be fun? What if we do it like a genie? What if we give David 3 options? Option 1 is 3 years of famine. Option 2 is 3 months of fleeing from enemies. And option 3 is 3 days of plague. Which one does David choose? Option 3. Why? Because he says he would rather fall into the grace of the hands of God than be left to that of man. Well, that worked out well for David because he survived. But you know who didn't? 70,000 of his men. That gamble certainly didn't work out. Well, it depends, right? Because again, if God's will is just to keep David alive, then David chose correctly. Do you see what I mean about God being more than willing to gamble with other people's lives that are outside of his his small little will, the God of collateral damage. That should be its own video. In Jeremiah, we see the great exile bet. God has to punish his people. He's going to use Babylon to do so, and so his people go into captivity. The bet here is that his people will return to him. And some do, and that doesn't go very well for them, but many assimilate into other traditions, cultures, and religions. Even the ones that go back take so much that they learned with them that has crept in and created a lot of the actual religion that we see today. Pre-exile and post-exile are very different than the Bible leads you to believe. Most of the Old Testament was actually probably written as this amalgamation of oral traditions and stories during their time in exile. And what absolutely bled into that, including monotheism in general. If you want to learn a lot more about that, check out my series on God and Anatomy. It will blow your mind. Remember that time when God bet an entire city over the obedience or disobedience of a man named Jonah? Well, it didn't actually turn out to be that big of a bet because God was relentless until Jonah did what he was supposed to. So much for free will. Go read that story and tell me that free will exists. Problems everywhere. That's what's so funny about all of these. Any apologetic that you bring up to excuse any of these examples will immediately lead to another issue, if not a bigger issue. We can probably move into the New Testament or just some abstract examples in general. I don't want this to go on too long. I was going to list Judas as an example, but that's more of a sacrifice than it is a gamble. I mean, ultimately, Judas had two choices, right? He could not betray Jesus and save his own soul, or he could betray Jesus, which was God's will and necessary for the salvation of literally everyone, but have to become the scapegoat himself. Doesn't really fit, but I thought about it while putting this list together and thought it'd be worth pointing out the issues. How about risking your entire evangelical plan off mainly a group of teenagers that followed you around? This is the story of Jesus and his disciples. Or the risk of not telling them the very same information that supposedly you're going to tell Paul a few years later, causing insane division, confusion that trickles down to this day between the Christian sects and denominations who can't figure out the difference between being saved by works and grace. You know what was a gamble? Paul, relying on half of your New Testament to come from one man that never met you physically, and then choose to have his letters that he writes in very different moods to very different specific church groups and call that doctrine for all. If you've been following me at all recently, you know all the issues with Paul. And yet, this is God's singular bet for Gentile conversion, which is the vast majority of everyone that will ever live. While we're talking about Paul, let's talk about church leadership, since that's something Paul was setting up. What a gamble it is to have church leaders instead of, I don't know, God himself. Why do we have to rely on faulty, sinful, manipulative, power-hungry men every single week without fail? Every single week, I read another article, if not multiple articles, about some youth pastor, some church pastor, some elder who is sexually abusing or stealing funds or gets caught with a minor. Well, those aren't the real Christians, Brandon. Why not? You can't just so easily dismiss these people. This is the system that was set in place by God himself for the discipleship and evangelism of his word and his people. It's a horrible system. It is indeed a bet. All of those children who have been abused by anyone in a position of church power, and that number is shockingly and terrifyingly high, are on the bad side of God's bet that humans could lead themselves spiritually. And now I'm kind of just jumping all over the place here. I hadn't thought of this one, but it just jumped into my mind. Remember that part in Revelation where Satan is going to get released again? Talk about an unnecessary gamble. By the way, let's just back all the way up. Satan ever getting the chance to have any kind of authority or dominion over this earth? Huge gamble, right? You don't need him for free will. You don't need an agitator for free will. Think about that for a second. This whole thing about, I don't want robots, I want perfect worship and love by choice, that can happen with man left to his own nature. Adding in an antagonist, an enemy, a deceiver, a possessor, again, is stacking the odds in the wrong favor for these bets. And it's inexcusable. And we see that again at the end in Revelation where he's released for another round. If you believe in all this, how many people are in hell or will be in hell because of this dominion given to Satan? I cover it quite a bit in my Why Spare Satan video, but it is simply without excuse. But let's end with a few abstract concepts. I don't necessarily have a verse to tie these things to. I think we can all say that there's been unanswered prayer. That's a gamble. only answering some people's prayers? Like, there's so much Christian apologetics, I bet a lot of you don't even think this is an issue at first glance. Well, yeah, Brandon, God can't just answer everyone's prayers all the time. Why not? And if not, how does he choose? Again, it's either his sovereign will, so he's only answering the ones, and we actually know this to be true, scripturally speaking, that align with his will, thus rendering prayer completely useless, or he's playing favorites, or it's dependent off of the person's works, or how long they prayed, or how sincere they were, or all of these horrific things that cause shame and judgment and guilt. Again, apply it to a parent. What if I only ever answered the questions that came from one of my children? What if I only met some of their needs some of the time? I would get locked up, literally. Oh yeah, I only wanted to feed that one. Yeah, that one's starving to death and they're begging me for food. Not gonna do it. Free will. Do you see how stupid this is? Like, honestly, it really does just stop me in my tracks that there's any amount of apologetics that works. When you bring it into such a real and rational concept and comparison of a father choosing to feed and nourish one child and not the other, there is no amount of excuse that ever makes that okay for a human parent. Ever. Never. But God does it en masse, and it's totally okay. In fact, it's beneficial. It's God's plan. It's perfect. It's all loving. What an impressive thing apologetics is, that it has convinced anyone that there's acceptable answers to these things. We pretty much just get a hit on all the big things here. Divine hiddenness, same thing. Just don't show up. Provide literally zero evidence for yourself outside of people's anecdotal experiences that can be completely manipulated, and also point to any other god or religion. That won't cause mass confusion. That won't cause doubt. That's a good way to judge people. Are they willing to believe with no evidence? Again, going back to New Testament scripture, we're actually told that that's better. Oh, doubting Thomas had to require evidence, but it's better not to. What? How stupid. Even God allowing multiple religions. This is a concept that obviously exists, but it didn't have to, right? We see God interfere all the time in the world, always corrupting free will. It could have just not been a thing that we could have come up with other gods, other religions, gods and religions that came before this God, gods and religions that provide the same level of comfort, the same gap-filling answers, the same grounding for morality, the same knowledge and wisdom, and often many times better. If you're a Christian and you say you believe for this reason, or this reason, whatever it is, there is a Muslim or a Hindu, or pick any other religion, there is a person from those religions that can say they believe for the exact same reason. Well, my holy book says so. Well, I feel it. Well, I know a miracle happened to so-and-so. Well, it's my personal experience. Well, look at the trees, all of it. There is literally nothing unique in terms of a way to distinguish this God as true from any other. That's insanely problematic. What a gamble that God has allowed that. And again, sometimes people just can't tell my sarcasm. I don't believe that that's the case. To be blunt, I'm hoping that this points to you how man-made it all is. Not that there's actually some inept, stupid God up there. Of course not. That's the whole point. Remember when God tried to assert that there is both free will and predestination? That's quite the gamble. How are you going to marry those two things together? How are you going to avoid that confusion? How are you going to stop that from splintering and separating churches and denominations? What about the moral progression gamble? That God was going to show up physically in one time in history to give law, to give rule, that we today would find unacceptable and immoral, and also that he would claim himself to be immutable, never changing. If you want to see the dissonance of this played out in real time, watch Ben Shapiro struggle with the answer from Alex here.
Do you think that the ownership of other human beings under the conditions of the Hebrew Bible are immoral?
Yes.
So how do you account for God permitting something and giving you details about how to do something which is proactively immoral?
He's not permitting me. Permitting my great to
do something immoral.
To do something
immoral.
That in the time was not considered immoral.
It wasn't considered immoral,
right.
But was it immoral?
By today's standards that were developed by the Judaic.
See what I mean? You can't make sense of it. You can't justify it. And yet God bets that we'll get past it. And unfortunately, he's right about billions of people. He's also wrong about billions of others. And that number is growing bigger every single day. What about the Bible itself? What a gamble to have one delivery method for all time that didn't exist for a vast majority of human history. And since it has existed, has not existed in the same state, constantly changing and being edited and having books removed and added formatted and hasn't existed with access for everyone equally at the same time, and has not been updated to any other media source. God should have a YouTube channel. If he can write a book when books are popular, he should have a YouTube channel when YouTube is popular. Isn't the whole point this God wants to communicate with his creation, to be recognizable? The fact that we're left with some errant scripts from multiple anonymous authors over the course of hundreds of years in 3 different languages that the vast majority of people who will ever read the Bible simply don't know is an insane gamble from God for his plan of communication. It's a really stupid bet, actually. I should have been doing a theme of betting and picked like poker, blackjack, or roulette or something, but this would be like splitting tens at the blackjack table. Oh, here's what I was talking about earlier that I want to get back to. This is the apologetics gamble, essentially using men to fight your fight. This is God's entire plan in general, not just with apologetics, but with evangelizing, with reaching people with this news. He entrusted people that he also says have a sinful nature, people that he also says are fallen from birth, people with a heart that he says is deceitful above all else. That's his grand plan for communication outside of the Bible or defending the Bible, thus apologetics. What perfect creator would ever step back and say, yeah, I'm going to let them handle this, even though I made them so broken? Many people have said it, but I stand with them. The very fact there has to be apologist is very damning evidence against this God. Let's just end with maybe the biggest gamble, the method of salvation. For the first part of God's plan, it's about being in the right group. Yikes, that sucks. But at large, the salvation plan is blood magic, human sacrifice, and a belief, despite evidence, that that works. You are to put your entire hope in the fact that a virgin teenager gave miraculous birth to a baby boy that was somehow both fully God and fully man, that doesn't contradict itself, that same baby boy is the same who was with God at creation, who is the Word itself, who somehow for 33 years lived a sinless life, not one bad thought, since thoughts are a crime and a sin, that he performed something no one else could do, that he was tempted in all the ways that we are tempted, even though that's clearly not true. And if he was able to remain pure and sinless when no one else could, maybe it's because he was the Son of God or God himself. But that would make his perfection kind of pointless and render it ineffective. And even though he doesn't look like what the Messiah was promised to be and didn't do the things the Messiah was said to have done, we'll just believe, according to some anonymous authors, that he was perfect, he did die, he was the Son of God, he did raise again, and all you have to do is believe that. Oh, and also that it was 100% necessary and the only way. That there's nothing else this God could have done. That this whole thing got away from him. That even though he had perfect foreknowledge and was all-powerful, sin entered the world through no fault of this God. We all have it innately in us through no fault of our own, God's decision to have collective punishment and generational curses, and that only by the literal blood spilling of a split deity from a virgin birth are you forgiven, but only if you believe in it, and then probably act accordingly, whatever that looks like, even though it's not spelled out clearly in the Bible. God's bet is that we'll figure all that out, that it'll make sense to us, that we'll believe in it, that we won't see the patterns of repeating dying and rising gods, that we won't see the influence from other pantheons and religions or the Hellenistic period, that we won't understand that this God came from a Canaanite pantheon himself as a lesser deity, that the original people who worship this God had no concept of him in the way that we do, and on and on and on. It's truly dumbfounding. And that's it. That's today's video. All the many gambles of this God, risking, again, our well-being, our lives, and our eternal fate. Very curious to hear everyone's thoughts on this one. I will see you Tuesday with another takedown. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, GVI, Jacob, Jason, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, Shawn, and StrongRex, my Humanist heroes, Imposter, James, Jarrod, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Jeff, Jeffrey, Mrs. Webb, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people today.